It should have been an incredible memory for these 16-year-old high school students on an overnight field trip. In the middle of their dream school break, a nightmare materialized. Usually it's the misadventures of teens that land them in trouble. In this case, it was their unwavering discipline that sealed their fate. This is the fatal breakdown of the Sewol Ferry Accident. On April 15, 2014, the entire sophomore class of Danwon High School was heading out for an overnight field trip to the beautiful island of Jeju. It's every 16-year-old's dream to hang out with friends, without parents around, in a fun and carefree trip. This is where lifelong friendships are forged, and memories are made that they would talk about for years to come. 325 students boarded the Sewol Ferry for the nearly 14-hour trip to Jeju Island. This vessel was a blend of a traditional ferry and a vacation cruise ship. The lower levels had areas for vehicles, containers, and cargo that needed to move to and from the island. The upper levels had more traditional cruise ship accommodations. There were cabins for sleeping, a cafe for dining, a karaoke hall, and a small convenience store. Their teachers ushered the students along and advised them against disturbing the other 100 or so passengers traveling to Jeju. The kids had their run of the ship and enjoyed the freedom of dining, talking, and singing with their friends. The night was capped off with a fireworks show from the deck of the ferry. The teens fell asleep with dreams of tropical beaches, but a series of bad decisions by those in charge would turn it all into a devastating nightmare. The Sewol Ferry had been remodeled a few years before this ill-fated trip. More cabins were added up top, and additional cargo space was added below. These adjustments in the structure caused the center of gravity to be raised, as well as causing a left-right weight imbalance. This put new limits on its safe operating parameters. It was only certified to carry 1,000 tons of cargo, but on this day, the Sewol was carrying 2,200 tons of cargo, including 185 cars. It would also be required to have 1,700 tons of ballast water to keep this ship properly manageable. Ballast water is kept in the bottom of the ship to weight down the center of the ship and keep the upper portion counterbalanced. The ballast water is essential to keeping the ship properly responsive to speed, turns, and maneuverability in the water. Because the Sewol was slightly top-heavy in the new design, the ballast water was particularly important on this vessel. Since the Sewol was significantly overweight for this trip, the ballast water was reduced to just 760 tons. This kept the ship sitting a little higher in the water at the dock, so that it would pass port inspection without raising alarm for being overweight. As a whole, this made the weight about the same as when they had the proper distribution of cargo and ballast, but the result was an entirely different ship to navigate through the narrow channel they would be facing. At 7:30 on the morning of April 16th, two crew members, a third mate and helmsman, started their shift steering the ship. At 8:20, they switched the autopilot off and took over manual controls to maneuver through the Mangle Channel ahead. It was 8:46 when the third mate instructed the helmsman to turn 5 degrees to the left. Just 2 minutes later, she asked for an additional 5 degrees, but they quickly realized a dangerous list was beginning. In a pivotal mistake, the helmsman had turned the ship a full 15 degrees to the left while trying to reverse the last degree change. They might have been able to recover from such a sudden turn, if only the cargo was secured properly. Compounding the turn error, there weren't enough anchors in the cargo area to strap down the 185 vehicles in the lower level. The sudden turn caused a chain reaction of weight shifting. As cars and containers slid toward the left, the ship listed more, which caused more cars to shift to the left. By 8:49, the ship was listing 20 degrees in the water. The open cargo door was submerged and allowed water to enter the cargo area, causing the list to increase to 30 degrees by 8:50. Over these couple of minutes, the captain and most all of the crew had returned to the bridge to see what was going on. At 8:50, the engines were shut off and the engine room was ordered to be evacuated. At this time, the passengers were in the cafeteria eating breakfast or sleeping in after a night of fun. They noticed the sudden stop and lean of the ship, but didn't understand what this might mean. The intercom system was used by the communications officer to ask that passengers remain where they were and not to move, claiming that it would be dangerous for them to move. The students laughed and joked about the ship breaking or sinking like the Titanic. Mostly they figured that whatever the problem, it would be resolved by the professionals, and they would be back on their way in no time.
이게 뭔 상황인지 모르겠어. 구명조끼 입으라는 건 침몰되고 있다는 소리 아니야?
It was 8:52, and the ship's 30-degree lean became significant and unnerving. The lowest levels were filling with water coming in from the cargo area. The added weight continued to pull the ship lower, letting more water in. At 8:55, the ship made its first distress call. The Vessel Traffic Service, VTS, like air traffic control for ships, was notified that they were rolling and in danger. The VTS notified the Coast Guard to initiate assistance. To their surprise, a student had called the Coast Guard a few minutes before, and they were already on the way. Over the next few minutes, the ship's list grew to 50 degrees, all while the communications officer was still ordering passengers to stay where they were.
안전하니까 가만히 있으라고. 그런 거 주는 거야. 영국 왜 다 그러잖아. 그 지하철도 그렇잖아. 안전하니까 좀만 있어달라고 했는데 지하철도 있었는데.
우리 진짜로 이만큼 귀여운 거야. 진짜야 이거.
다른 사람들은 살고.
At 9:14, the crew reported that the angle of heel made evacuation impossible. This is the unbelievable reality that the ship was actively taking on water, leaning at an unsalvageable angle, and yet the passengers were still being told, over and over, to remain where they were. The VTS told the Sewol to ask passengers to put on life jackets and told Captain Lee to make the evacuation decision immediately. At 9:30, he ordered evacuation to begin. This was clear for the 15 officers on the bridge, but the rest of the ship had no idea. The ship-wide communications went through the guest services desk on the 3rd floor. The bridge, up on the 5th floor, only communicated through a two-way radio to deck crew that the evacuation should start. Exactly who received those orders and how they shared those plans is unknown. No officers left the bridge to share the information or confirm that orders were being carried out. The students and passengers who made it out stated that there was never an intercom announcement to evacuate. It was 9:33 when passengers and crew started jumping into the water. There were several nearby fishing ships that had moved in to help, as well as the Coast Guard arriving on scene. Those passengers that were near balcony areas on the upper floors were able to make their way off the ship, even though the leaning was now near 60 degrees. At 9:38, the final communication from the ship's bridge was sent to VTS. The ship had lost power at least 30 minutes before, but the lack of further communication wasn't because the radio didn't work. It was because the entire navigation crew, including the captain, had left to abandon ship. The ship-wide notification to the passengers continued to be, "Stay where you are," so the teachers and students were in cabins leaning against walls, trying to stay calm and waiting for further instructions. They were texting their parents, taking videos, and calling home to share that they were scared. Their videos show a bravery and discipline that is hard to fathom. Some male students pulled themselves up to the hallway to check on a small group of girls. They didn't have life jackets, so the boys were trying to enter another room to find some. They ended up surrendering their own jackets so that a few of the girls might have one. The difficulty of movement is hard to convey when the ship is listed at such an angle. Just opening a door requires an unbelievable coordination of leverage and strength. Imagine a door on the ceiling, and you needed to climb through it to go down the hall to the stairs, which are now completely on their side. When the Coast Guard did emergency training, it took them 15 minutes to exit a room at a 60-degree list. This was 5 professionally trained men working together. How were teenagers expected to get out of the rooms when the ship was leaning 60 degrees already? They may have been trying to climb out or waiting to float up with the rising water. Unfortunately, wearing a life vest inside an enclosed structure filling with water makes escape a slim possibility. Groups of students in some rooms were rising up against the walls and corridors without anywhere to exit. It was a devastating situation that seemed to unfold in slow motion. By the time the Coast Guard had arrived, the ship was so far over that there was very little open space for a passenger to exit. Only those that had moved to upper open decks beforehand would be in position to get off the ferry. The rest of the passengers would have been completely trapped inside. Students who figured this out tried to break the windows in their rooms, but to no avail. They could literally see the rescuers and boats outside the window, but had no way to escape this steel trap. At 10:17, the last text message was sent from anyone on the ship. By 10:23, the ship was completely upside down. This hopeless situation left rescuers paralyzed. Once the exit points were underwater, the teenagers that may have been working their way out would have been unable to save themselves. They would have had to go down under the water through a maze of corridors and stairwells to reach the open sea. They knew that the Coast Guard was just outside and probably sought the highest points with available air to wait for rescue. Over the next hour, the ship just sank lower and lower until it was completely submerged underwater. Parents and rescuers just hoped that air pockets inside might offer refuge to some of those still trapped. The complete lack of communication between the various Coast Guard stations, the Sewol, and the VTS, kept crucial facts from coming together at the scene. When the first Coast Guard boat arrived, people started abandoning the sinking ship. Between 9:30 and 10:15, 172 people were rescued by helicopter, fishermen, and inflatable lifeboats. Of these 172, 26 of them were crew, including all 15 of the navigation crew who were responsible for the vessel. The captain of the ship was lifted off the ferry at 9:47 a.m. The communications officer announced the last "Stay where you are" message 5 minutes after the captain was off the ship. Korean law dictates that the captain oversee any evacuation and to remain with the vessel until the passengers are removed. He was not wearing his uniform and did not disclose any information about the souls on board. The boats that were on scene were not informed that there were more than 300 people still on the ferry. They thought that the order was given to evacuate, and all the people in the water were the majority of passengers. The sickening part is that if the evacuation order had actually been given at 9 o'clock, or even 9:15, when it was clear that the ship would sink, then it is likely that most of the passengers could have gotten off the ship safely. There were enough boats, helicopters, and rescuers in the area by 10 o'clock to pull them all from the water. Indecision by the captain, and the unbelievable instructions to stay in their rooms, sealed the fate of 304 souls. The communications officer was instructing people to stay in their rooms until the intercom shorted out at 9:52. At this point, the ship was nearing 80 degrees of list. The passengers on the ship received no further communications after this announcement. The captain was already safely transferred to the Coast Guard's ship, while students were trying to break through windows and crawl along hallways. Imagine being one of those 16-year-olds, listening to the announcements and your teachers telling you to stay in your room. You can't even stand on the floor because the tilt is so great. In South Korea, the children were taught in a strong culture of obedience. Standing out or making trouble would reflect poorly on you and your family. Thus, most of the students were waiting for permission to leave the rooms, even as water started to enter.
물이 더 차니까 더 어두워지잖아요. 창문으로 계속 저희가 가라앉는 게 보여요. 그러고 있다가 이제 점점 물도 조금씩 차고 그래서 막 캐리어 같은 거 밟고 있었단 말이에요. 항상 그런 데 가면 말 잘 들으면 된다. 저희는 그 말을 잘 들었을 뿐이고.
The videos show evidence of teens who thought it was no big deal at first. As the listing increased, the videos and messages became clearly more frightened. Eventually, those that could still use their phones were recording goodbye messages and sending loving texts to family members. The understanding of what was actually happening was devastating.
나 울 것 같은데. 나 진짜 나 웁니다 나. 나 개무섭습니다 지금.
The family members who had communicated with their kids were clearly worried. News reports started immediately and were completely wrong. The Coast Guard had reported that everyone had been saved. Once the survivors started trickling in from the rescue boats, it was clear that hundreds of students were still missing. During this time, the Coast Guard presence at the scene had grown extensively. It seemed as if they were there to rescue those that might be still alive in air pockets. The parents had a false sense of hope that more children would be brought back safely. In reality, the Coast Guard wasn't doing anything to try to board the ship. Not once. The closest they got was a rubber boat that picked up a few passengers standing on the sinking ship. It would have been a dangerous endeavor, and they were not trained in any way for such rescues. This critical omission was brought to light with this tragedy. Several members of the crew who stayed on board were instrumental in saving the lives of those passengers who made it out. Surviving students recounted their heroic efforts before these crew members perished with the remaining passengers. Over the next days and weeks, many private divers entered the ship to recover the bodies of the lost passengers. Many crew members, company officers, and government officials were held accountable for their roles in this avoidable tragedy. Although there are many contributing factors in this case, the most glaring failure was not advising the passengers to move to upper decks to muster for a potential evacuation. This basic step could have saved hundreds of lives.